All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We're glad you could be here for our program this evening with Sarah Okner, the Life in a Japanese Internment Camp. We have a few more programs this season before the end of the year. There's still a couple of spots open. There's a Charles Dickens program tomorrow evening. There's a couple spots available still for our holiday cocktails program on Thursday. And then our last adult program is a virtual walking tour of St. Petersburg, Russia next week. So we hope you can join us for a few more of these. We know it's a busy time of year, but we appreciate you taking some time this evening. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, so I am going to share my screen so that way you guys can see the presentation. There's going to be lots of visuals, lots of video clips and everything in here. So let me just get that started for you. And again, thank you all so much for attending tonight. As Sydney said, this is, I know, a very busy time of year. So the fact that you're taking time to learn a little bit about American history, to take time to, support your local library is definitely appreciated. So before I begin, I want to talk a little bit about some of the terminology that I'll be using today. Many of you might have heard of words like internment and evacuation and relocation used to describe this part of our nation's history. And the problem with that is that these words actually fail to really fully encapsulate the entire experience of the Japanese American community during World War II. The government would use euphemisms like these to describe their really inexcusable actions. And they did so, the government did so fully aware of how misleading they were being. And language is powerful, and it's often used by those in power to distort and minimize the experience of marginalized communities. We see it today, and it was definitely the case in the 1940s. Now, the terms evacuation and relocation, they sound like something that's done as a precaution, a safety concern before a natural disaster, rather than a targeted forced removal by soldiers with the threat of jail time if you did not comply. And the word internment actually refers to the detention of enemy aliens in a time of war. The people put in these camps were not enemies. They were, and the term aliens is honestly dehumanizing. And these were real people. These were families and children. So calling these places internment camps is also misleading because the vast majority of the Japanese American community were United States citizens. These decades-old terms are still around. I've used them for many years, which means that most Americans learn about this event through a distorted lens that really diminishes the harsh realities of Japanese American World War II incarceration. In the words of Japanese American activist Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga, she said, "Words can lie or clarify. And when we use language that distorts the past, we lose our ability to recognize when history repeats itself. But language that imparts truth and understanding can help us avoid repeating those same mistakes today." So instead of evacuation, you'll be hearing me say forced removal. And instead of relocation, you will hear me say incarceration camps or internment camps, because you deserve to hear the truth. Okay, so this is a photograph of my grandma Kay, who's in the orange, my grandpa Jerry, and one of my great aunties at just a family reunion a few years ago. And my grandmother and other relatives have been talking about camp for as long as I can remember. And of course, when I was very young, a lot of the more complicated details were left out. As my relatives told me stories of the mess halls, the barracks, and the dusty dirt roads, for the longest time, I honestly thought we were talking about a sleepaway camp. And it wasn't until I was older that I came to understand what my grandparents' childhoods truly looked like. It boggled my mind how a country like ours, the land of the free and the home of the brave, would incarcerate its own citizens without trial and without due process, especially when you consider the fact that in spite of the many accusations of espionage and sabotage, Not a single person of Japanese descent was ever prosecuted or proven guilty for either. And my grandmother, Kay, was 9 when she was taken from Salinas, California, and my grandfather, Jerry, was 16 when his family was removed from Sacramento. These are 2 pictures that very few images that we actually have of my grandparents in the incarceration camps. The one on the left-hand side is my grandmother hanging out with some of her girlfriends when she's about 2 years old at the Post and Evacuation Center, Relocation Center. And some of you might recognize the uniform that she's wearing. See, she was actually a very proud member of the Girl Scouts. So interesting fact, chapters of the American Boy and Girl Scouts were very, very popular in these camps. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the extracurricular activities available for students and for children in a little bit. And on the right-hand side is a photograph of my grandpa Jerry at the Jerome Relocation Center. And he's standing in front of his barrack with 2 of my great uncles as well. Now, another image that I always like to share is this one. My grandfather's family owned a barbershop in Sacramento before the war. And I like sharing this image because it demonstrates that even though they were very young, they and their families led full lives before the war began. You know, that these were real people. These were sons and daughters, parents and neighbors. And tonight, we'll explore the realities of everyday life experienced by those folks, by over 120,000 Japanese Americans imprisoned in these camps. And again, it's important to remember, 2/3 of these folks were US citizens. Now, while many may see this as a story of fear and loss, it would be impossible to ignore the hope and perseverance that blossomed in the deserts and in the swamps of the camps. And despite the fact that their dignity, that their basic human rights were taken away to supposedly protect the populace, internees and detainees were still able to maintain a sense of identity, raise families, and find purpose. But before we go into the camps, we first have to see how they came to be. When one student was interviewed about his experiences right after describing the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, he said it was as if the world fell about our ears. The morning of Sunday, December 7th, 1941 was a quiet one for Yoshiko Uchida and her family. You can see Yoshiko here is pictured with her mother and father and an aunt in front of their family's church. And there wouldn't be any visitors for lunch that day. And it was unusual because the Uchidas were very friendly with all of their neighbors, with their community members, and they would usually have people over for lunch every weekend or so. So even though it was unusual, Yoshiko was actually really grateful for this. Just 4 months shy of graduating from Berkeley, she was anxious to spend the afternoon studying for her exams. And as she sat down to eat with her family, the pressing voice of a radio news anchor rang throughout their small California kitchen. That morning, it announced, Pearl Harbor had been attacked by Japanese fighter pilots. From across the table, Yoshiko saw her mother's face twist in shock, and her father, a businessman, rose from the table and turned up the volume on the radio so he could hear the story more clearly. As the anchor continued, the Uchidas sat in silent disbelief for a few moments. Her father, in an attempt to remain optimistic, smiled nervously and shook his head. He assured his wife and daughter, "This is only the work of a fanatic," he said. "We have nothing to worry about." And it never for a moment occurred to anyone at that table that this would be the beginning of America's involvement in World War II, or that they would be stripped of their civil rights in the months that followed. Now, on February 19th, 1942, a mere 10 weeks after the attacks on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This little piece of paper carried a lot of weight for the Japanese American community. This order put the Secretary of War and his commanders in charge of establishing guarded military zones, which you can see from this map here, consists of the entire state of California and the western part of Washington and Oregon and southern Arizona. The military was given power to impose restrictions on anyone it deemed a threat within this military zone. And this order gave the military power to do all of this without hearings or trials or due process. And while no specific races or ethnic groups were mentioned in the order, it became very clear whom they were targeting. And soon posters like these were hung in towns all over the West Coast. My grandfather remembers posters of the executive order being hung outside the barber shop that his family owned. And again, all of this was done without hearings, without trials, without due process, and the regulations from the military came very quickly. First, everyone of Japanese descent living in military zones had to register at designated offices. Then the government enforced curfews, and soldiers began patrolling the streets of predominantly Japanese American neighborhoods, very early in the evening to very early in the morning. To do all of this, the government created the War Relocation Authority. I'll refer to it occasionally as the WRA, to take charge of organizing, registering, and eventually relocating Japanese Americans. And their first job was to start the process of removing families from their homes by force, if necessary. Whenever I talk to my grandmother about her time in camp, something she would always tell me is we could only take what we could carry. And this wouldn't be much, maybe 1 or 2 suitcases at the most. And that's not a lot of space, especially when you consider that the government would be providing very little in the incarceration camps. Families were required to bring many of their own supplies. For example, this is from Civilian Order number 5. This was some of the information the Japanese Americans were given from the government before they were put into camps. And you can see on the supply list, there's bedding and linens, no mattresses. Japanese Americans actually had to make their own mattresses out of canvas bags and straw when they arrived in camp. Any sort of toiletries for each member of the family, extra clothing, plates and cutlery, forks, spoons, knives, all of that for each member of the family. And if there was any room, any personal effects that you might have. But even with a list, how do you begin packing for a journey when you don't know where you're going or how long you'll be gone? What made forced removal so frightening was that families did not know what the government was going to do with them. Jail, deportation. At the time, it was actually against the law for Asian immigrants to apply for naturalization, no matter how long they had been in the country. So my great-grandparents, the ones who ran the barber shop in Sacramento, had been in the United States since the 1920s, but because of several racist laws on the books, they were not able to apply for citizenship. So there was this big fear that elderly relatives without citizenship could just be deported. Confusion and misinformation abounded, again, because there were no trials or due process to properly inform folks. Now, when the process began on March 22nd, 1942, newsreels like this one from Paramount News called Out They Go announced its start with a tone wavering between fear and contempt. And not only does the newsreel never once describe or mention that 2/3 of those being forcibly removed were US citizens, but it even uses a racial slur that really we wouldn't use to describe them.
Japs evacuate vital West Coast areas for the national security. At Los Angeles, 36,000 Japs see the handwriting on the wall and sell out their goods before their voluntary departure.
So evacuation was not voluntary. It was absolutely the law. Families had very little time to prepare. Lucky folks got a few weeks' notice, others just several days. As a result, they were forced to sell their homes and their property at a fraction of their true worth, and many were easily cheated out of their possessions and faced financial ruin. One particularly infuriating example I came across was a woman in Southern California who was forced to sell her 26-room hotel for $500. Farms and homes were abandoned by those who couldn't or wouldn't sell. You know, folks locked them up in hopes that after the war they could return. We can see this is a photograph of a small grocery store in San Francisco that's being boarded up. And now we get to this question. And plenty of people have asked this question. I know I asked dozens of times when I was a teenager. Where was the outrage? Where was the anger? Why on earth would you cooperate with forced removal when it was such a clear violation of your civil rights? In part, I learned it's because there was nothing that they could do. There was nothing they could do to stop it. Prejudice against Japanese Americans was prevalent long before the start of World War II. And again, this happened at a time when segregation was the law of the land. As minorities, they had very little say in local, let alone federal government. And those who did not cooperate were arrested on federal charges. Powerful politicians and political groups, such as the Native Sons of the Golden West, lobbied for mass incarceration. The government was very, very deliberate on how information about the camps was being shared, if at all. And remember, without social media like Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, regular folks couldn't connect with each other and share information the same way we can now. And so lies and misinformation about Japanese Americans spread like wildfire. Compounded with the existing racial prejudice so ingrained in American culture, many people bought into this notion of sneaky, slanted-eyed people who couldn't possibly be loyal to the United States, that their true allegiance could only lay elsewhere because they looked so different. You can see here, this is a political cartoon, and the caption above says, "Waiting for the signal from home," and it very clearly illustrates this idea of, just this sort of mass group of Japanese American folks sort of blindly following orders from home in air quotes and everything, looking across the sea, waiting for some sort of a signal to. And as a librarian, this image always really interested me because if you haven't recognized the style of this illustration already, you probably recognize the name at the lower right-hand corner of this illustration. This is actually written by Dr. Seuss. So even some of our most trusted and beloved American figures just really bought into this idea because there was so much misinformation spreading around the country at that time. After Pearl Harbor, suspicions against Japanese Americans were very high. And many folks were afraid that protesting could actually make them appear even more suspicious to their non-Asian neighbors and could be seen as a sign of guilt. So really it was encouraged within the Japanese American community to cooperate with the government as much as possible. There was this idea that by leaving quietly and calmly, you would be demonstrating your civic duty, showing your patriotism, and prove that you had nothing to hide. Again, as a teenager, this was a concept I didn't necessarily understand. I saw this as a passive act of just allowing yourself to be walked over. But the more I learned about the Japanese American community at the time, and the more stories that I heard from my grandparents, I came to understand that this attitude came from a sort of a Buddhist idea called Gamon. And Gamon is this Japanese idea of demonstrating strength in the face of difficulty and suffering. This idea of calling on something inside of yourself to endure the unbearable with patience and with dignity. It was an outlook meant to help families cope with and deal with the circumstances that were just simply beyond their control. So soon, families were counted and numbered and tagged. The forced evacuation or forced removal or evacuation was carried out in several stages. Depending on where you lived, families were transported by cattle trucks or buses if you were in more rural areas, or trains if you were in larger urban centers, to assembly centers where folks were organized before being sent off into the incarceration camps. Now, assembly centers were held in old fairgrounds and racetracks. The Army very quickly built barracks and hastily cleared horse stalls of waste, as these were going to be repurposed as housing for families. My grandmother remembers arriving by bus at the gate of Santa Anita Racetrack, which was the largest of the 17 assembly centers, around 3 o'clock in the morning. And again, she was 9 when she experienced this. And she told me, all I remember after getting off those hot trains and buses, we had to keep the curtains closed so no one would see there was a bunch of Japanese in there, is all these people. I had never seen so many Japanese people in one place until I got to Santa Anita. I saw the stables and barracks, and I thought, this is home? But not for long. Within a few weeks, families gathered their belongings once more and boarded trains and buses for the camps, known officially as relocation centers. Now, people were detained in camps from May of 1942 to as late as 1946. And as you can see on this map, there were 10 camps in very isolated areas of the United States. The nearest city to any of these camps was miles and miles away. After my grandmother was in the assembly center at Santa Anita, her family was transferred to Poston, Arizona, which is right on the border of Southern California and Southern Arizona. And they remained there for the duration of the war. My grandfather's story is a little bit more complicated. He was moved around several times. First, he was sent to Tule Lake up in Northern California, and then over to Jerome, Arkansas. And when Jerome closed in 1944, his family was moved to Gila River, Arizona. Now I see a few folks raising their hands and things. I will have time at the end to answer questions, and I'm happy to go back to any of these slides as well, of course. So after many days of traveling, Japanese Americans, they looked forward to getting off trains and just stretching their legs for a little bit. Initially, they were comforted by the idea that centers were run by the US government. Surely after all of their cooperation, they would be well taken care of. So you can imagine their shock when they arrived at the dusty deserts and the swamplands of the camps. This is actually a photograph of Heart Mountain in Wyoming. Not a lot to see in this photograph, unfortunately. In fact, when detainees began arriving, many of the camps weren't even ready. Sewage systems, schools, and barracks for housing weren't completed or even built yet. Initially, the government and War Relocation Authority didn't want to waste time and resources on luxuries like schools. The camps were considered temporary communities. But as it became clear that folks would be living in these facilities long term, eventually the Japanese Americans were expected to finish constructing the camps themselves. It was unsettling, and it was a little humiliating. Now, finding themselves surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, many detainees' first impressions made for their most vivid memories. In this next interview with actor and activist George Takei, he's going to describe adjusting to his new surroundings at the War Relocation Center in Arkansas as a 5-year-old. I particularly like this interview because it'll really give you an idea of how strange and how foreign these parts of the country were to detainees, especially to young children who had spent their entire lives all along the West Coast.
We got to get a view of the area. They were all black tar paper barracks. The mess hall was in the center, and the barracks were lined up beside the mess hall. And beyond the mess hall, beyond the barracks was a barbed wire fence, and beyond that was a dense, lush, swampy woods. And there were sounds coming from the woods. It was very exotic, cawing sounds and screeching sounds. And I remember my father telling us about jungles and some of the creatures that lived in the jungles. But there was a kid there who told us that there were dinosaurs living out there in the swamps, and that those were dinosaur sounds. And so that's when I first found out about these prehistoric beasts living out there. But and they sounded scary. But the kid told me that we didn't have to worry because the barbed wire fence would keep them out. we were safe.
So as silly as that sounds, again, George Takei was 5 when he experienced all of this for the first time. That line, the barbed wire fence keeps them out, we were safe, it's striking because it's actually something that many detainees heard for very different reasons other than dinosaurs, of course. My grandfather and a lot of other young people remember, sort of looking around, and when they had the opportunity to try to ask some of the government officials who were in these camps, why on earth are you putting us in here? How can you justify this? And the answer that the Japanese American community received from the government by and large was, well, folks, there are a lot of people who blame you for what happened to Pearl Harbor because you happen to look a lot like the people who flew those planes. And they want to cause you harm. They want to hurt your family. They want to hurt your children. So the best thing that we can do for you as a government is to keep you safe, to put you in these camps to make sure that nobody can come and harm you or your family. So again, the idea that the bad guys are out there, we're going to keep you safe here. And my grandfather, again, in high school would sort of look around and wonder to himself, well, if the bad guys are out there, why does the barbed wire fence curl inwards towards us? And why are the guns and the guard towers and their patrols always pointed on the inside of camp instead of on the outside of camp? My grandmother recalls with this incredible clarity the barracks that she and thousands of others were to call home for the next several years. In an interview, she told me, I still remember exactly where we lived in camp, block 213, barrack number 4. They put all 8 of us, my 2 parents and 6 kids, in a tiny room, I think about 20 by 25 feet. The building was only made of wood planks hammered together, and the outside walls had tar paper covering them. Our barracks were made in such a hurry that you could see the gaps in between the planks when you moved in. The heat, again, she was in the Arizona desert, the heat made the boards shrink. And I think the gaps got to be maybe 1 or 2 inches wide in some places. The gaps in the floor were really bad. We had to check our shoes in the morning for sand or scorpions that crawled into them in the middle of the night. You can imagine barracks offered virtually no privacy. Each family was assigned a single room apartment within a barrack, and if you were by yourself or had a particularly small family, occasionally you would have to share apartments with strangers. Now, this is a photograph that was actually taken for a government information pamphlet about the camps that would be distributed to communities relatively close to the incarceration camps. Again, the nearest towns were, miles and miles away, but you can imagine a lot of folks were concerned about these big government facilities with Japanese American folks that were going to be in their state. So the government put together these information pamphlets to sort of give comfort, to the average American citizen. Look how well we're treating the Japanese American folks in here. Look how they're not so dangerous, but we are going to keep an eye on them just in case. So this particular example in here is one of the very, very nice living quarters. Now, barrack apartments didn't have toilets, so residents would have to use communal bathrooms, which didn't always have running water at first. My grandmother remembers having to walk 2 blocks to get to the bathrooms, and those walks were particularly scary in the middle of the night as well. When you're imagining, the washing facilities, I want you to envision just an empty barrack full of exposed shower heads and exposed toilets. The 2 pictures on the lower half of this slide are actually reconstructions of the washing facilities at the Manzanar Incarceration Center, which has now been made into a national park. And this is a place that you can actually visit and really get a good idea of what it is these folks lived through. And the illustration up at the very top of this slide is by Mine Okubo, and she has illustrated a lot of scenes from her time when she was in these camps. And her work offers us a very, very intimate idea and picture of what these camps were like. see. Families, they did try to create some sense of privacy by using sheets and fabric to create privacy curtains. But again, there was a lot of people who had to use these facilities. So unfortunately, a lot of folks were honestly embarrassed to use these places. But of course, despite the meager living conditions and the starkness of the barracks, Japanese Americans, they worked hard to create some sort of sense of comfort in their new homes. They would use sheets to make partitions within the apartment, get a little sense of privacy, and built furniture from scraps of wood left over from construction sites within the camps. A very good example of this you can actually see over here in the right-hand picture. Let's see, sort of right next to the bed on the right-hand side. This is actually a little nightstand and a little desk that was made out of several pieces of wood from a leftover construction site and everything. And you can see here too, so the photograph on the right-hand side is a few family members, a couple of sisters and cousins, and they're trying to make their new home as comfortable as they possibly can. And they are, taking their handkerchiefs and hanging them on the windows to give themselves, again, some curtains, a little bit of privacy, because the War Relocation Authority, when it came to your living quarters, all they gave you was, a big empty room, some sort of heating element, so a coal burning stove or a wood burning stove, a metal bed frame, and that was basically it. So folks really used whatever it was that they had with them, again, to create some sort of semblance of home. Now, barracks didn't have running water or cooking stoves either, so meals all came from a communal mess hall. Mess halls were too small to serve everyone at the same time, so each family was given a meal schedule. And to this day, my grandmother incredibly remembers that schedule. It is just ingrained in her brain. She would tell me that lunch was served at 7 a.m. sharp, breakfast was at 7, lunch was at noon, and dinner was at 6 p.m. And if you missed your shift, well, you better hope that you had some non-perishables back in your barrack to tide you over until the next meal. The residents would have to wait in long lines, rain or shine, to enter the mess hall until other families finished their meals. You can see in this picture here, everybody's waiting a very, very long line, and a lot of the women are carrying, you could see these sort of parcels with them. Now, what these folks are doing is that they are actually carrying all of their cutlery and plates with them. You'll remember in Civilian Order number 5, that was one of the lists that was on the list of items that people had to bring with them. So folks had to bring all of their own plates, forks, cups, knives, spoons, everything to and from every meal, and wash them in a communal sink and a communal trough. Now, incarceration was hard on everyone, but for children, their world was turned completely upside down. Everything from where they slept to the food that was on their plates was completely different. They were fed government commodity foods and cast-off meat from Army surplus. So things like hot dogs, ketchup, kidneys, potatoes, and Spam. This is actually the first time my grandmother really remembers ever eating Spam. And a lot of folks in the Japanese American community will still have a lot of it in their cabinets and everything. That was one thing that sort of, stuck with them throughout the war and onward. But you can imagine the Japanese diet and family table were virtually erased. One particularly memorable dessert that one of my great aunts remembered was a scoop of rice topped with a can of scooped peaches or canned peaches. And now the mess halls, they impacted families socially in a lot of unanticipated ways as well. In this next interview, Kaz Fujishima recalls the effects of the mess halls on her family.
As a matter of fact, when we went into camp, there was a separation in families, and I do feel that my father did not have control of us as much as he did on the outside. And so life was much easier for us girls. though we were supposed to eat as a family unit, but you would see that us teenagers all got together and ate together, and the parents would sit with their friends and eat together with them. So the family unit was broken actually when we went into camps.
So this is something that I would see a lot when I would be interviewing Japanese Americans who were in these camps, this idea of trying to insert a little bit of humor. Life was so much easier for us girls because we didn't have to sit with our fathers and our family and everything, so it was fine. And it's always really sort of struck me this incredible resilience that a lot of former internees had to. They're trying to take the situation even decades later and trying to, again, make the best of a bad situation, trying to say, well, it was rough, but we still got through it and everything. And again, interjecting a little bit of humor into things. But in the chaos of the dining hall, the families no longer ate together. The family table with its traditions and conversations began to fade. And in many cases, camp damaged family relationships for years to come. So what was day-to-day life like in these camps? Now, you didn't have to work, but most adults wanted to. Jobs helped to pass the time and were a way for folks to feel some sort of sense of self-worth. It was also a way to earn money for their families who were, still looking ahead, albeit even though their pay was kind of low. Now, unfortunately, there weren't nearly enough jobs to go around. So what exactly was available? Because the War Relocation Authority wanted camps to be as self-sufficient as possible, most jobs involved physical labor to keep the camps up and running. My great-grandfather on my grandmother's side was a carpenter before the war. So when he arrived in camp, he was hired to help build some of the barracks and schools and mess halls that his family would be using over the next few years. Other folks worked as farm laborers. So every camp operated farms, and crops were often exchanged in between camps. Let's see. So these consisted of 48-hour work weeks, often the sun, and under, again, military guard, of course. Folks also worked in warehouses to keep shipments of food and supplies in order for the detainees and for the military who were being stationed in these camps as well. Jobs like these paid about $12 a month, which if you adjust for inflation, it's about $195 in 2021 currency. If you were a doctor or a nurse before the war, you could work in a camp-run hospital for slightly higher pay for $19 a month. Again, a bit better, but insulting still when you consider the fact that white nurses employed at these hospitals were paid $200 a month. And though camps provided detainees with very basic medical and dental care, conditions were less than ideal. This is a photograph of an emergency hospital at Manzanar, California, and you can see that the beds are very, very close together, and the next patient is just a few feet away. There are no curtains to give any sense of privacy for the patients, and the walls are just, sort of just bare, exposed wood. Unfortunately, qualified staff were often hard to come by, and medicine shortages were actually often very common as well. Sometimes it was difficult just to get aspirin at times. Now, there were other jobs that would go towards the war effort as well. This is a photograph of a couple of women. This was actually photographed by Ansel Adams. A few women who are creating camouflage nets for the United States military. So there were a lot of folks within these camps who wanted to do everything that they could for the war effort. But things like making safety nets, making safety posters, war bond posters just weren't enough for some folks. And other people wanted a more direct way to help their country. However, the government refused to give them this chance. In fact, in January of 1942, Japanese Americans who were already in the service were discharged and reclassified as enemy aliens, unquote. Many folks, as you can imagine, were heartbroken by this, but those who were discharged petitioned the military to reinstate them. One letter from a young man read, "The United States is our country. We know but one loyalty, and that is to the Stars and Stripes. And we wish to do our part as loyal Americans in every way possible. And we hereby offer ourselves for whatever service you may see fit to use us." After receiving countless letters and petitions like this one, in 1943, the Army created a segregated all Japanese American unit called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Now, everything that the 442nd did could fill another lecture and everything. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a rundown of what these folks did. The men of the 442nd felt they needed to prove their allegiance and show others back at home that they were true Americans inside and out. This team went on to fight with uncommon distinction in Italy and Germany and France, where the 442nd became best known for rescuing the lost battalion in the Vosges Mountains. Over 14,000 men volunteered or were drafted into the 442nd. And by the end of the war, it became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service. This is a record that the 442nd still holds today. And what I find most miraculous about all of these men is that while they were fighting overseas, their families were still behind barbed wire at home, imprisoned by their own country. These men were fighting not just for America's freedom, but for their families, because ending the war also meant ending the incarceration camps. And speaking of these soldiers' families, we're going to head back to the home front for a little bit and talk about something that kids experienced every single day: school. So schools were very hastily cobbled together. And the government designed curriculum was mainly meant to keep students occupied, out of trouble, and educated about American customs. Never mind the fact that all of these children had grown up going to American schools and all of that. So what did classrooms behind barbed wire look like? Well, to say schools were ill-prepared would be kind, according to some of these former detainees. Class sizes were immense. For example, at the height of attendance, Rower schools had 2,339 students with only 45 certified teachers. Now, that averages out to about 51 pupils per instructor. Camp schools didn't have enough supplies very often, books or even furniture for their students. And some families built makeshift benches and chairs from scrap lumber left behind by construction workers. My grandmother and thousands of other students like her carried their homemade chairs several blocks to and from school every day, so she wouldn't have to sit or kneel on a dusty floor like these third graders did at Manzanar. Now, government officials attempted to convince students and families that these conditions would help build character. One administrator noted in a formal memo that, quote, "adversity is often a challenge to the best qualities of human nature," unquote. A lot of government officials actually believed that they were giving Japanese Americans an opportunity to perform their civic duty by doing more with less. But this much less? Now, many younger detainees, including my grandmother, were generally shielded from the hardships of camp because of their innocence. But high schoolers who were older and much more aware of their situation were deeply impacted. Students very clearly saw the contradiction between what they had learned in school pre-war about democracy and what they saw in their daily lives, filled with guard towers and barbed wire that surrounded their makeshift classrooms. The experience left open emotional scars that shaped their opinions about the world long after they left camp. But despite being torn from their homes and the hardships they now faced, there was still a glimmer of hope among Japanese Americans living in these camps. And as best they could, they attempted to carve out new lives for themselves. Folks created their own community organizations, clubs, and sports teams. You can see here, this is the Winnetka incarceration camp, one of the baseball teams there. And this is a volleyball club at Manzanar. Again, another photo that was taken by Ansel Adams. An interesting fact, actually, Ansel Adams and Dorothea Lange, who is probably best known for this photograph of a mother during the Great Depression, they were both commissioned by the government to document all of this, to document the internment, the incarceration experience. And something very interesting happened when Adams and when Lange returned their photographs to the government. And the government actually decided to censor all of these images, not because they were graphic like other wartime images or anything, but because the government was a little concerned that if the general public saw these photos of families, of children walking around in these camps in these conditions, that the general American public might start sympathizing with Japanese Americans. And for a very, very long time, these photos were not available to the public. Luckily, now we can access them through many, many books and also through the digital archives of the Library of Congress. But anyway, back to some of these activities that Japanese Americans created for themselves. There were also glee clubs and student councils, literary magazines, Spanish clubs, chapters of the American Boy and Girl Scouts as well. And perhaps what's most interesting is that all of the students, all of the kids in these pictures, they look like your average American kid, you know, dressed in bobby socks and saddle shoes. Some of them were even still wearing their Letterman jackets from the high schools that they had come from out west. And it's not until you look in the background of these images, when you see the barracks, when you see occasionally the barbed wire fences, that you realize that this is not your average American childhood. Now, it's very important to note that none of these organizations received any sort of financial support from the government or from the War Relocation Authority. And Japanese Americans, they paid for their own uniforms and sports equipment and other supplies, or they were very resourceful and found their own ways to make them. This is actually this is another artifact from the Manzanar incarceration camp that is on display at the museum there. And I'll give you a moment to sort of guess what you think this might be. And if you were thinking baseball, you were absolutely right. This was actually home plate that was made from a piece of wood that was sort of taken down from a construction site too. You can actually still see sort of towards the top, the little holes where the nails had pierced through the wood. So cheering for, for families and friends on the sidelines, sports and other activities, they really did a lot to make people feel normal, even for just a little while. Even if it was just for one inning, any moment that you could forget about guard towers and barbed wire was a good one. And if sports weren't necessarily your thing, that's okay. The very interesting thing about these incarceration camps is that you had hundreds and hundreds of people all together in one place who all had very different, very interesting skill sets. So volunteers, essentially, if you were willing to teach something, people were willing to take that class. Volunteers taught a wide variety of classes. There were things like flower arranging, calligraphy, art, sewing classes as well. My grandmother, who grew up to be a seamstress, told me she actually learned how to sew for the very first time when she was in camp. So a lot of practical skills being shared as well. And in spite of their bleak surroundings, art and artists really thrived in the camps. Their work are really, again, some of the best images that we have of camp life on a very intimate level. This painting here is probably one of my favorite pieces that I've come across in my research for several different reasons. First of all, this is a painting of Poston, Arizona, which is where my grandmother lived for several years. Also, the composition of this painting is really beautiful too. Even decades later, the blues are still really vivid, and so are the reds as well in the clay. But the thing that really, really gets me about this painting are the materials that were used to construct it, to make it. You can sort of see about 2/3 of the way through the painting, there's this little shadow that goes all across, the top and the bottom. And that is there because this was made on a piece of corrugated cardboard that was left over from a delivery from the mess halls. So again, folks were, this idea of taking whatever it was that you had and making it beautiful, just making the best that you could out of this situation. I feel like this painting really, truly embodies that message very, very well. And families, they also celebrated the simple pleasures of everyday life as much as they could. So this is a photograph of families ice skating at Heart Mountain. The temperatures at Heart Mountain would get very, very cold in the winter time. And really the best way to stay warm was to stay active. Again, you couldn't, necessarily keep terribly warm in your barracks because the barracks were made of wood and tar paper. So being active, moving around was really a good way to stay warm. And so families were able to get skates, again, with the permission, from the government, from the military officers in camp. And they would take fire hoses and they would spray out the water on these wide tracts of land. The barracks were often spread out very far apart from one another because being made of wood and tar paper, unfortunately, they were very flammable. So the barracks being spaced far apart was really done as sort of a fire precaution. And again, gave you these wide open tracts of land for baseball fields and for ice skating rinks too. So Japanese Americans would take fire hoses, they would spray these large tracts of land, and they would create these ice skating rinks. And this is a very bittersweet picture for me as well. Again, probably one of my favorite images from camp that doesn't come from my family's personal collection. You could see this father, he's teaching his little boy to skate, and he's holding on to his son's hands so very, very tightly. And I have a couple of nephews about the age of that little boy there, maybe about 3-4 years old or so. And you can see in the moment, they're really enjoying themselves. They're really caring for one another. But I look at this photograph and I can't help but wonder what went through this father's head late at night after he had tucked his son into bed, after his son had fallen asleep. What was he worried about? What were his thoughts? Did he wonder what sort of future his son would have? Would his son go to high school in these camps? Would he be ever able to get a steady job? Go to college, go to a trade school? How long would he be in here? How long would future generations be in these camps? Lots and lots of young parents were worried about all of these things when they were bringing their children into camp. Now, luckily for this family, they didn't necessarily have to wait terribly long to find out what would be in store for them next. Because in December of 1944, the government passed a proclamation declaring that the camps would close beginning in January of 1945. And at that time, families began registering for leave passes that looked just like this one. These leave passes were incredibly important for former detainees to have on their person once they were out of camp, to have them, pretty much everywhere that they went. Because these leave passes told officials in new communities that you had permission to be there. You were considered safe and you were cleared. Now, after they were released from camp, some families did attempt to return to the West Coast and rebuild their lives. And while several had kind neighbors who guarded their property and took care of their land and businesses, many other folks were surprised to find that their homes or farms were taken over or simply vandalized beyond repair. This is another photograph that was taken by Ansel Adams, and this is a family who have come back to their home in Southern California in Los Angeles. after being at the Manzar incarceration camp for 4 years. You can tell the little ones are still having a hard time kind of understanding what exactly is going on. Dad's trying to put on a brave face for the camera for his family, but I really think that the look on the mother's face just really, really captures the hurt and the heartache that a lot of these families who moved back to the West Coast experienced. So fearing prejudice and potential violence back on the West Coast, the vast majority of detainees traveled eastward, like my family. My grandmother's family left for New Jersey to work for a large farm, and my grandfather's family left for Chicago, and that side of the family has been here ever since. And after the war, the majority of Japanese Americans, they wanted to keep their profiles low. They didn't want to cause waves in their new communities, and many parents actually urged their children to, even to refrain from saying that they were Japanese at all in fear of persecution. My mother remembers my grandmother, instructing my mom, Cindy, if somebody asks you if you're Japanese, you don't know why. So either change the subject, end the conversation, or flat out lie. They can't tell the difference. Let's see, and something else that a lot of children of detainees experience too is that my grandparents were either reluctant to teach my mother and other kiddos in her generation Japanese, or really discouraged them from speaking it outside of the home. And this was, again, for sort of similar reasons. My grandparents were very much afraid that my mother or my Aunt Linda might be speaking to each other in Japanese, on the L in Chicago, and somebody might hear them, somebody might not like it, and somebody might act on it. So after, let's see. So when their children, my mother, when her generation, really learned about what their families went through, they wanted action. They wanted the government to answer for what they had done to their families. Because a lot of these folks, like my mother, didn't really understand what her parents had gone through until she was much older, again, because a lot of the detainees, my grandparents' generation, great-grandparents' generation, didn't really want to talk about their experiences. And so, it's thanks to the folks in my mother's generation that this part of history has really been able to be pushed forward. And after many decades of work by activists, folks convinced President Jimmy Carter in 1980 to conduct an investigation to determine whether putting Japanese Americans into these incarceration camps was justified. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. The investigation's report, called Personal Justice Denied, recommended that the government pay $20,000 in reparations to survivors. And yes, that sounds like a lot of money, but is $20,000 worth 4 years of your life? And something else important to note too, you were only able to receive reparations if you were actually in the camps themselves. So unfortunately, a lot of the people who had been the most impacted by this financially had already passed on. These payments didn't really go into effect until the early 1990s. And so my great-grandparents and other folks in the generation were already gone. Just to give you an idea of the sort of economic hardship that the Japanese American community faced back in the 1940s. In 1948, President Truman signed the Japanese American Claims Act, which gave the Japanese American community an opportunity to submit claims for property and possessions that were lost when they were incarcerated. Despite the lengthy and confusing application process, 23,000 claims were submitted for damages totaling $131 million. 23,000 claims. Again, there were 123,000 individuals incarcerated by the government. And out of that 131 million that was submitted, only 38 million was awarded. So less than a third of those claims. Now, the thing that really truly did impact the Japanese American community, and something that they really took to heart was in 1988 when Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which offered a formal apology to former detainees. And these are actually a couple of copies of letters from Bill Clinton, from President George Bush, formally acknowledging what the United States had done to the Japanese American community, and formally acknowledging that what they did was wrong and unjust. And these two letters, really more than any sort of check, is what's most valuable out of all of this. And now for many Japanese Americans, calling their allegiance into question and the years of wrongful imprisonment left a devastating impact on their lives. It left deep wounds that shaped their views of the world and themselves long after the camps closed. And the impacts of incarceration are still felt by the Japanese American community today. Now, detainees were no less aware of the racial injustice that created the camps, but they took the camp's institutions and they made them their own. Despite being told that they were untrustworthy, unwanted, and un-American. They refused to let their circumstances or other people's prejudices define who they were, and they rose above those hardships, largely on their own. It didn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be this way. We need to look out for one another, and we need to make a promise to ourselves, to them, to never let something like this happen again. Not on American soil, not anywhere, because we as Americans are better than that. And in my opinion, the kindness, the quiet strength, and the courage of my grandparents and other former detainees like them is truly what makes them American. Thank you very much. See, and I think that we have some time for questions. So let me stop sharing my screen for a moment. There we go. Okay. So I see a couple of folks who are raising their hands and things. I think perhaps what might be easiest, unless Sydney, you have another suggestion, is folks might be able to type in their questions in the chat.
Yeah, I think that is probably the easiest. So if you want to just go to the chat. Let's see.
And thank you all so much again for, for taking the time to listen a little bit more, about this topic. I do have a bibliography that I will be sending to your librarians a little bit later in case you're interested in more reading about this. They're, nonfiction books for adults, for teenagers, for children. So really something for everyone and their interest level.
Okay. All right, I see one person has their hand raised. Are you able to put your question in the chat? Right, here we go. No. Do you want to try putting your question in the Q&A then? It looks like that's working. And do you see the question, Sarah?
I do, yes. The question from Mark. So let me my screen a little bit bigger. So how many Japanese Americans how were the Japanese Americans in Hawaii treated after December 7th, 1941? Were restrictions and treatment even harsher, more restrictive, or what actually? That's actually a very interesting question, Mark. So the government actually considered for a little while, again, forcibly removing Japanese Americans from the Hawaiian Islands to the mainland. But once folks started crunching the numbers and they realized, one, how expensive it would be to transport that many people from the islands to the mainland, and two, how much it would impact industry on the Hawaiian Islands. Japanese Americans were a minority majority. And so, Hawaii's economy would have essentially been crippled had that many people been taken out of the labor force. So what the government decided to do instead was put all of the Hawaiian Islands under martial law. So there were still patrols and there were still, military guard walking around. But very interesting fact is that a lot of Japanese American Hawaiians didn't know that the incarceration camps were happening at all on the mainland. In fact, a lot of folks didn't learn about it until they joined up in the 442nd, and you had a lot of Japanese American Hawaiians and a lot of Japanese American mainlanders meeting for the first time and sharing their experiences. So the government, again, did a very, very good job as far as keeping information from folks. Let's see. Oh, and I see another question in the Q&A. Did the people in the camps have information about the war and what was happening? That's a great question as well. So any sort of information that entered camp and also left camp was very heavily censored by the United States military. So anytime a package was mailed into camp, anytime there was a letter that was sent into camp, whether the letter was from a schoolmate that was still living in Los Angeles, or perhaps a son or a father who was in the 442nd and writing a letter home, each of those documents would be screened by the military, and elements would be redacted. Sometimes elements of packages would be removed and things too. So not a lot of information really went into camp about the outside world. There was some sense that, yes, we're doing well, we're winning, but any really sort of specifics, really, the detainees weren't allowed to have that sort of information. Let's see. Okay, and I see, let's see, another question. What is the best way that we can make sure people remember that this happened? Honestly, talking about this and sharing, this sort of history, that's honestly really why I do what I do. My thesis when I was at university was about the education system of the incarceration camps and things. And for me, as a descendant of internees, it's so important to share these stories, which is why it makes me so happy. Bittersweet, of course, but it makes me very happy that there are so many books that are coming out now that are sharing these stories. There's a really wonderful book called They Called Us Enemy, which was written by George Takei. It's a graphic novel, actually. It's really wonderfully done, and he collaborates with an artist, and you really get to see not only his point of view visually, being incarcerated in these camps, but you also really learn about what his parents went through as well as adults. So the best thing that you can do is to read as much as you can about this, to watch documentaries about on YouTube. I also want to recommend any TED Talks that George Takei has done about the incarceration camps. He did a really wonderful one several years ago that I highly recommend, but share this information and these books with your families, talk about them and everything. It's a hard thing to discuss for a lot of people. I know a lot of folks are very reluctant to even really acknowledge this part of our history, but it is so important because it is a way that talking about this part of our history is a way to pay our respects to the people who survived all of this and are a way to ensure that this doesn't happen again. Something very interesting that I remember talking with my family members about is that right after the September 11th attacks, there were a lot of hate crimes and violence being perpetrated towards people who were perceived as Arab, as Middle Eastern, and a lot of the language that was being used to sort of describe these folks felt very familiar to a lot of survivors of these internment camps and these incarceration camps. And so there was a lot of allyship and support from the Japanese American community to Middle Eastern Americans in the United States saying, hey, this all feels very familiar. We don't want this to happen again. It's our responsibility to keep people in check. So yeah, just sort of talking about all of this is very important. Okay, sorry, I see another question. Did your grandmother and grandfather and others who you know who spent years at the camp suffer emotionally and psychologically later in life? I asked because one of the Nisei I knew, so Nisei is the name of the generation of Japanese Americans who were born in the United States. So Issei are Japanese immigrants who moved to the United States. Nisei are their children, so my grandparents. The one Nisei I knew who was about the same age as your grandmother had psychological problems stemming from her experience in a relocation camp through her adulthood. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear about that. Had nightmares and troubling memories that were difficult to work through, although she was eventually able to lead a relatively untroubled life. That is very true too. I know that, I say that there was a lot of former internees kind of had a bit of humor when it came to, let me see. Sorry, there's quite a few stories going through my head, so I'm going to make sure that I can sort of pin all of this down. The vast majority of Japanese Americans who went through this didn't necessarily want to talk about it a lot. I know that my grandfather, again, he was 16 when he was first put in camp, so he actually graduated from a high school, let's see, at Gila River. He didn't like to talk about this for a very, very long time. He was also drafted into the army during the war as well, too. And for him, this was a deep sense of shame that he carried with him for a very long time. This idea that, my own country doesn't trust me. These people who knew me for years don't trust me because I happen to look like the enemy and everything. So there really was a deep psychological impact left on people. There was one gentleman that I had interviewed in the early 2000s who had told me that he didn't start voting in elections until the mid 90s or so. And this was a man who at this point was in his 80s. And when I asked him why, his response really sort of shook me. It still does. He said, well, when I was younger and we'd just gotten out of camp, I was thinking to myself, well, government didn't want to listen to me then. Why would they want to listen to me now? And so he didn't feel like he had a voice to be able to vote. And a lot of other folks felt the same way. And now, luckily for this particular gentleman, he had grandchildren who were very politically active and very, very excited about their civic duties. And he eventually learned, he's like, this is the best way for me to make sure something like this doesn't happen again, to make sure my voice is heard, to vote. But I mean, you can see how very deeply that impacted folks, even decades later.
Are there any other questions? See anything in the chat? All right. Well, Sarah, I can't thank you enough. This program was, incredibly well researched, obviously, but more importantly, your sort of personal connection and sharing the stories of your family make this program even that much more special. So I really appreciate you sharing your experience with us. And as we'll look forward to getting some resources. I think that is a great way of paying this forward and making sure that people continue to hear these stories. And we'll also have this recording available through our YouTube channel for the next couple of months to come back and watch if people want to look at it again. So appreciate your time and your expertise. And thank you all for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at the next program. Have a good night.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome.